Equal housing lender. Licensed in all 50 states. NMLSconsumeraccess.org, number 3030.
Welcome back. This Tuesday, February 18th, 2020. It's a good day when I get to, when I know I get to talk to my good friend, our good friend, Dr. Zuhdi Jasser. He is, of course, the president and founder of the American Islamic Forum for Democracy, author of a great book, A Battle for the Soul of Islam. Dr. Jasser, welcome back. Happy Tuesday.
Thank you, Seth. It's always a great Tuesday to be talking to you.
Thank you, sir. You had this interview in the Christian Post, which is getting circulated everywhere on social media. It's a fantastic interview having to do with things Iranian, from Soleimani to the protests in Iran to even the latest news, which a lot of us have been trying to wrap our heads around, this news report that Senator Murphy and a few other Democrats, including former Secretary of State John Kerry, have had a private meeting, unauthorized private meeting with Mohammad Javad Zarif, the foreign minister of Iran. This interview that you did, it's really good. It's really comprehensive. And I was wondering if I could just revisit it with you and kind of just get you, unvarnished and unplugged by asking you some of the same questions this interviewer did with you. Can I do that with you? It's really
Absolutely.
good. I would love to do it. I'm going to change some of this because I don't agree with the premise of the question. But the first one was the U.S. right? I'll use a different word. Was the U.S. right to kill General Qasem Soleimani?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, if the Democrats on the left wanted to wring their hands over it, they should have 8 months ago when we declared the IRGC a foreign terrorist organization, because that's when they said they should have said something, but they didn't. They waited until we actually did what's lawful, is to try to destroy the heads of a foreign terrorist organization in order to prevent them from acting. And what President and the administration did was remove and eliminate the most lethal head of a terrorist organization in the Middle East, who had an aura with him that needed to be extinguished. And I can tell you right now, even the Syrian regime's effectiveness, one of the reasons you're seeing Russia helping Syria is Iran has lost significant capability with Hezbollah and the operations in Syria and Yemen because of Soleimani's absence. You can't replace a guy like that. So we're safer as a result. And for the Dems to say this is a declaration of war on Iran is just, they should have said something last year when we made them an FTO, and they didn't.
Why did they say nothing about the ongoing numerous declarations of war and acts of war that Iran has taken against the United States, starting with the seizure of a U.S. embassy in 1979, starting and perhaps ending with the attack on a U.S. embassy, which is our territory, after all, in countries like Iraq, and any number of engagements in between, including violations of international law, mining international waters, mining tankers, oil tankers, seizures of hostages throughout. All of those are not only declarations of war, they're acts of war. Democrats have been silent about those for going on 40 years.
It's really, I don't know which way to look at it. It's almost as if they are so obsessed with partisan politics that they can't see past their nose about what's happening in the Middle East. And it doesn't matter about the war crimes in Syria. They seem to take the side that sanctions are bad for the people, when in fact you know that sanctions are what has pushed the revolution in Iran and has pushed the decrease in the ability of Iran to spread terrorism. And yet the left is constantly, because of their anti-Semitism, calling for sanctions against our allies like Israel, and yet when it comes to Venezuela and Iran, they don't. So nothing makes sense other than the fact that they have an obsessive syndrome of just anything that they can try to tag on President Trump, and the right they will. But if President Obama was doing the same things with drones and elsewhere of assassinations, they don't care. They didn't say anything about it. But with President Trump, they do. So there's no compass of morality or rationality. It's simply about a Washington focus.
Let me stick with that point just for a second. I want to get to some of the other aspects of the interview too, but in a moment. But for another moment, if we could, on the head scratching inability to understand any coherence. You have people like Ilhan Omar, Rashida Tlaib, wanting to have boycotts against fully democratic countries like Israel, wanting to put sanctions on Israel, but opposed to sanctions against Iran. I was reading earlier directly, verbatim, from Amnesty International's report on Iran, and I'll give you just some of their language. I'm reading directly for you to tee off on. The authorities heavily suppressed the rights to freedom of expression, association, and assembly. Security forces used lethal force unlawfully to crush protests, killing hundreds and arbitrarily detaining thousands of protesters. They arbitrarily detained over 200 rights defenders and imposed sentences of imprisonment and flogging and torture against many of them. Didn't even get to ethnic minorities and women. I'll just tell you that, as you probably know, Amnesty International uses the language cruel, inhuman, and degrading. Cruel, inhuman, and degrading to describe their judicial system and the disappearances of people. Against that regime, we can't have sanctions. Against Israel, of course, yes.
And even, I'm glad you read Amnesty's report, because if you look at Human Rights Watch, which takes the Palestinian side, Kenneth Roth has been so missing in action with what's happening in Iran. Why? Because he is so far in with the Palestinian movement and the Islamists that he can't see straight anymore. And this is what's happening. They put on, if you will, and the interesting thing is, for all the fear of warmongering and other things, we don't have any troops in Iran.
Right.
We don't. This is not like Afghanistan or post Iraq War, Iraq, or even Syria, where we had some troops. There are no troops in Iran. So to say that somehow all of a sudden this is going to trigger a conflict, when in fact all the evidence shows that conflicts have been more triggered by Obama's appeasement, which gave them a green light to spread the billions that he handed back to them in order to spread terrorism. So the compass doesn't make sense, other than the Islamist radicals in Congress now, along with the Marxist who's leading the Democratic primary right now, seem to be more in bed with our enemies than actually with rational advancement of human rights abroad.
It's an amazing thing. It's a complete abandonment of human rights, as much as it is anything like some kind of moral compass pointing anywhere close to north. But let's move on, if I can, along the way on this interview. Do you have time for another segment after this, by the way?
Yeah,
good.
Sure.
All right, because there's a lot in here, and I just think it's fantastic. The interviewer at the Christian Post asked you about the protests we've seen over the past several months in Iran, and says, how do you read these protests as different from other uprisings in Iran, like the 1990s and like 2009. I have my own answer on the difference between 2009. I'll just give it to you, but you say anything you want. The difference between now and 2009 is the American president now has said on public record he's standing with the protesters. The president in 2009, the president of the United States in 2009, said he wasn't going to meddle. When you say you're not going to meddle, when one side has guns and one doesn't, you're actually taking a side. But you tell me your answer. Why are these different?
It's so different, and you're exactly right. To underestimate the influence of the global pressure, not only from the United States, but from Europe, that recently France had even signaled that they were going to dump tons of investment from their companies into the Iranian regime, and that actually now with the kickback of the sanctions was fantastic, because it really broke their back, and they had to quadruple the currency rates, and has been a huge influence. So to say that the United States' current position has no influence is one thing that's just bizarre. But the other thing is, it's always interesting to me that there's always this hand-wringing about, look at what happened with Iraq, look at what happened with elsewhere, and you've got all the different variables where Iraq's invasion was not after an Arab awakening. There was a Persian awakening in 2009, which was even before the Arab awakening happened, that was stifled by Obama. So now the era of Iran going down is post-Arab awakening. So even the historical context is extraordinarily different. The diversity of this revolution is much different. The one in 2009 was just Tehran and was more simply students. This one is very diverse with women and students and anti-theocracy, with businesses and else. So it's a much more diverse revolution that's all over the country and not simply in Tehran. So there are a lot of elements to it, but you cannot overestimate the importance of the American position in giving them a signal. And there's been so many viral videos from Iran thanking President Trump because they realize how much of an impact that has.
Yeah, that's right. You have to go to Twitter to watch some of these things, to see some of these things. You never, ever read about it in the New York Times or see it aired on CNN. We're talking to Dr. Zuhdi Jasser, founder and president of the American Islamic Forum for Democracy, author, A Battle for the Soul of Islam. His website, AIFdemocracy.org. We have a lot more with him. We'll be right back. Welcome back to the Seth Leibsohn Show. Delighted to have Dr. Zuhdi Jasser with us. He's the founder and president of the American Islamic Forum for Democracy, author of A Battle for the Soul of Islam, an American Muslim patriot's fight to save his faith. We're talking about Iran and this big interview he did in the Christian Post on things going on between the U.S. and Iran, and I wanted to reprise some of it here. Dr. Jasser, right before the break, you were talking about what it meant to the dissidents, the protesters in Iran, for this president to actually publicly state that the U.S. is with them. And a lot of people brushed that off. A lot of people didn't have much to say about it. But I remember reading interviews of Soviet dissidents after the Soviet Union was crushed, fell apart, people like Anatoly Sharansky, who would say that when President Reagan spoke of the evil empire, when President Reagan and Gene Kirkpatrick and George Shultz mentioned the name of the dissidents that the Soviet Union imprisoned, he said there's no amount of words they could express to say how important it was to the dissident movement, that finally it appeared like someone gave a damn about them. It meant the world to them when the president sided with them. People dismiss this today. It's a different world, I suppose, or it's a different kind of moral economy, I suppose. I'm not sure. But to me, it seems like there's a different standard that Donald Trump is being judged by when it comes to Iran than the standard Barack Obama is being judged by when it comes to who's supporting human rights and who's not, odd as it may seem to say.
Yeah, and I think, you're right. There's no doubt that however critical they were, whether it was President Bush or Reagan, there's no doubt that regardless of who it is, with President Trump, it's exponentially more amplified. But the bottom line is the left will not. I mean, if you look now, there's this new Quincy Institute, which took one of the biggest operatives for Iran, Treaty Parsi, who was running the National American Iranian Council, and I talk about this in the interview.
Yeah, I wanted to get to that. Yeah, good.
It's an intel operation for Iran. And they formed this Quincy Institute where Soros money and Charles Koch money came together and put $3 million down to start this new think tank. They abused and stole President Quincy Adams' name. I'm sorry, John Quincy Adams' name. And they called it Quincy Institute. Actually, the Wall Street Journal or National Review had a great piece saying how even this institute did not interpret his position correctly on foreign policy. And the bottom line is we're in an era where we realize that our military is not going to solve any of these problems.
Right.
We can protect us from radical Islamist terror groups like Hezbollah or Al-Qaeda, absolutely. But the war is going to be fought by commentaries like Reagan's and President Trump's and Pompeo's yesterday, where Pompeo publicly in Ethiopia called out those senators that met with Zarif and said, listen, these guys are our enemies, and they're free to meet with them, but it's the wrong thing. It's un-American, and he called them out. And that's not only President Trump, it's Secretary Pompeo, and many icons of our conservative movement are speaking out against this type of activity, and it goes a lot further with the Iranian people. Ambassador Grinnell from Germany, right. Our ambassador to Germany now has been calling this stuff out and speaking on behalf of so many people on the streets there saying that, the left just doesn't get it, and they're working with our enemies.
What explains a Soros or a Koch combination, or either one of them? What explains interests like that to support a regime as repressive as Iran? Soros calls his organizations the Open Society. Koch talks about libertarianism, which is at root freedom. Iran represents the opposite of all of that. Is it to poke America in the eye? Is that the point here?
That's fascinating. I think they misinterpret non-interventionism as being the Holy Grail, when in fact not doing something is, as you pointed out, that does do something.
Yeah.
And it abrogates the leadership role that the United States has, and the fact that we have so many things in our tool shed to do rather than simply send military troops. So what happens is they often join together, and they're looking for causes in which to bring the left and right together. So they say, we can come together, sort of like the Tulsi Gabbard tried to do in her campaign.
Right.
And when in fact it ends up falling flat because she had no strategy. She knew what she was against, these endless wars, as she kept saying, but you never knew what she was for. And what is America's leadership role in the world, and how do you do that? And I always wonder with the libertarians, if they're for free markets, why is it that their policies on free trade and other things don't end up actually holding regimes that oppress their people and prevent small businesses from functioning, and hold the Apples and others accountable for feeding off of the you-know-what of these countries? Mm-hmm. How come that isn't applied from a libertarian perspective? So there's some hypocrisies there because they're so short-sighted or narrow-sighted in the way they're approaching domestic politics.
Let me switch a minute to something you did at the end of the interview, which I thought was quite fascinating. We have about a minute and a half, 2 minutes left. It's a big question. Whenever I talk about the problems of marijuana, I'll get people say, well, how come you're not talking about the problems of alcohol and everything else? We can do it all. It happens to me when I talk about Iran. People will say, well, why aren't you talking about the depredations and how terrible Saudi Arabia is? We can do it all. But why don't you say a word about that, too? I mean, we are fighting both kinds of Islamism, are we not? And we can do it at the same time.
Oh, absolutely. And unfortunately, it just seems that we're pro-Saudi now because we're trying to correct the unbelievable Iranophilia that was happening, the Khomeinophilia that was happening under Obama. But the bottom line is they both want to establish a caliphate, an Islamic State. Saudi Arabia's recent position, now the Saudis just put out a major media piece with a Nazi sign over the founder of the Muslim Brotherhood's headpiece, which is amazing. To me, that's a revolutionary type of media thing because that's a Sunni group, and the Wahhabis are Sunni. Yeah. So they're beginning to move forward because of necessity. They're more pro-Israel than the left is in the United States today. Yeah. So, these things it's a genie that once it gets out, I don't care how much they're avoiding reforms. One of my things over the next year or two in our organization is to try to begin to look at, what is the best way Saudi Arabia can reform so that we can help them move them in the right direction. Perfect. But we're not taking the eye off the ball there either, right? Exactly. I do take it as good news. They have. I hope it's true. I hope we're going to do more than trust and actually verify that they said they're going to stop endowing building of mosques around the world, because that's been something like 80% of the mosques in this country have been built by Wahhabi fundamentalists, haven't they? That's coming to an end. It looks like they just announced, right? Exactly, and they need to follow that with clerical interpretations that actually support the rules they're doing, because otherwise you plant a poppy tree in Phoenix, I don't care who paid for the seed, it's planted. It's still going to produce marijuana and cocaine and other things. Nice. So this is the problem, is that the seeds have been planted, now we have to reinvent what fruit they're growing. Nice, which is your lifelong project at the American Islamic Forum for Democracy. Dr. Zuhdi Jasser, AIFdemocracy.org. Thanks for your time. More importantly, thanks for your brain.